Chapter 24. Responses instead of reactions. Most conflict does not begin with disagreement. It begins with speed. Something is said, a tone is heard, a face tightens, a message lands wrong, and the nervous system treats the moment as threat. The body moves first. The mind follows with explanation. Words come out sharper than intended. Silence arrives in a way that feels like punishment. A response is chosen not for truth or usefulness, but for relief. The person wants the discomfort to stop, and conflict becomes the tool. This is why so many arguments feel familiar. They are not original events, they are rehearsed sequences. When neutrality enters a person's inner life, the first change is not that they become agreeable. The change is that they become slower in the precise place where speed causes damage. They still notice provocation, they still feel the internal surge, but the surge no longer has immediate access to language. The gap appears. In that gap, a response becomes possible. A response is not a nicer reaction, it is a different category of behavior. A reaction is the nervous system discharging. It is sensation turning into speech, and speech turning into consequence. A response is chosen. Choice does not require coldness, it requires separation. It is the ability to feel the heat and still decide what will move the situation toward clarity rather than toward escalation. This is why neutrality changes conflict. It changes the function conflict serves. For many people, conflict is a method of regulating emotion. They argue to relieve tension. They correct to restore status. They accuse to regain control. They withdraw to avoid vulnerability. These behaviors often have little to do with the actual issue. They are attempts to manage internal discomfort through interpersonal pressure. The other person becomes a tool for regulation. When this is happening, communication cannot deepen because communication is not being used to understand. It is being used to stabilize the self. Neutrality interrupts this use of other people. A neutral mind can hold discomfort without needing to export it. It can feel unsettled without making the other person responsible for soothing it. This is one of the quiet gifts neutrality offers in relationships. It makes you less demanding. Not less clear, not less honest, but less emotionally hungry. You no longer need the other person to respond in a specific way in order for you to remain intact. That changes the entire tone of communication. Tone is often more decisive than content. Two people can discuss the same facts and reach different outcomes depending on the internal state beneath their words. When one person is reactive, they bring urgency, defensiveness, and interpretation. Even correct statements land as attacks. Even reasonable questions sound like cross-examination. The other person responds to the felt threat, not to the literal words. The issue becomes secondary. The nervous systems begin negotiating with each other. This is why conflict escalates even when both people believe they are being logical. Neutrality reduces the sense of threat without requiring softness. It does so by removing the implicit demand in the voice. A reactive person speaks as though the other must agree, must apologize, must understand immediately. They may not say this explicitly, but it is in the posture. The other person feels cornered and responds with resistance. A neutral person can speak with firmness while leaving space. The message is clear, but it is not coercive. The other person can breathe. Breathing is not a sentimental detail. It is the physiological condition required for thought. This is where communication deepens, when the other person can think while hearing you. A reactive approach makes thinking difficult. It pushes the other person into defense. Defense is a narrowing. Narrowed attention cannot absorb nuance. It can only protect. Many people think they are making their point when they are actually triggering protection. Protection does not listen. It prepares counters. Neutrality changes this because it makes protection less necessary. The other person may still disagree. They may still be uncomfortable. They are less likely to feel hunted. Hunting is one of the most common invisible dynamics in conflict. When someone is upset, they often pursue. They ask repeated questions. They press for immediate resolution. They repeat points with increasing intensity. They believe they are seeking clarity. Often they are seeking relief. The other person senses this and retreats, which increases the pursuer's urgency, which increases the retreat. The cycle becomes self-sustaining. Neutrality breaks the cycle by removing the pursuit. A neutral mind can state what is true and then allow silence to exist without filling it with pressure. Silence becomes usable instead of threatening. Many people fear silence because silence feels like loss of control. It feels like the other person might win by not responding. It feels like abandonment. In reality, silence is often where the nervous system resets enough for actual understanding to occur. A person who can tolerate silence without interpreting it can remain steady in the face of delay, confusion, or emotional processing. They do not require immediate closure, which means they do not create artificial closure through force. Force produces compliance, not understanding. Understanding is slower. It has to be earned. It requires that both people feel safe enough to admit uncertainty, to admit mistake, to admit limitation. Reactivity makes these admissions expensive because it punishes vulnerability. A neutral response makes vulnerability less costly because it does not immediately weaponize it. This is why neutrality can deepen relationships even when there is disagreement. It creates a space where the truth can be said without becoming a battle. Deep communication is not merely honesty, it is honesty without escalation. Escalation is what keeps many relationships shallow. People avoid difficult topics because the cost of conflict feels too high. They have learned that disagreement will become personal, that feelings will become weapons, that tone will become an indictment. They choose peace through avoidance. The peace is unstable because the issues remain. Neutrality offers another option, addressing what is real without turning it into a contest. Contest is what most reactive conflict becomes. The mind under threat wants to win. Winning can look like being right, being seen as the victim, being seen as the rational one, being seen as the strong one. The need to win often has little to do with the issue and everything to do with identity. Identity is fragile under reactivity. A neutral mind is less invested in proving itself through the conflict. It can let the issue be the issue. It can tolerate the discomfort of not being immediately validated. It can tolerate being misunderstood for a moment without rushing to correct the record. This tolerance changes the way you listen. A reactive listener listens for threat. They hear what confirms their suspicion. They miss what is actually being said. A neutral listener can hear more. They can hear the content and the emotion without becoming entangled in either. They can register that the other person is upset without treating the upset as an attack. They can register that the other person is clumsy without treating clumsiness as malice. This does not mean excusing harmful behavior. It means not inflating ordinary human imperfection into a moral crisis. Inflation is one of the primary accelerants of conflict. Neutrality reduces inflation by restoring proportion. A mistake becomes a mistake rather than a character indictment. A forgotten detail becomes a forgotten detail rather than a signal of disrespect. A sharp remark becomes a sharp remark rather than a final verdict on the relationship. Proportion does not deny pain. It prevents pain from becoming narrative. Narrative is what makes every conflict feel like a repetition of all previous conflicts. It drags history into the room and makes resolution impossible because you are no longer arguing about this moment, you are arguing about the story of the relationship. A neutral response keeps the argument in the room it belongs in. This has a practical effect on what is said. Reactive conflict tends to reach absolutes. It uses words like always and never, not because these words are accurate, but because they intensify the feeling of being justified. Absolutes are emotionally satisfying. They are also corrosive because they remove any path to nuance. Once absolutes are spoken, the other person must defend themselves against a total claim. The issue becomes less solvable. Neutrality tends to avoid absolutes, not out of politeness, but out of accuracy. Accuracy leaves room to move. Movement is what conflict needs in order to resolve. A conflict that cannot move becomes a loop. It repeats. Each repetition adds residue. The residue becomes expectation. Expectation becomes dread. Dread becomes withdrawal. Many relationships die not from one major betrayal, but from a long accumulation of unresolved loops. Neutrality reduces loops by making resolution more probable. They keep the conversation closer to facts, closer to present reality, closer to what can actually be changed. They do not allow emotion to drag the conversation into symbolic territory, where nothing can be repaired. Symbolic territory is where people fight about what a behavior means rather than what happened. Meaning matters, but meaning is often the most distorted element when the nervous system is activated. A person under threat assigns meaning quickly and harshly. They assume motive, they assume disrespect, they assume abandonment. These assumptions can feel true because they are paired with sensation, and sensation is convincing. Neutrality does not require you to pretend those meanings are not present. It requires you to treat them as hypotheses rather than verdicts. That small shift prevents premature conviction. Premature conviction is what turns misunderstanding into war. When neutrality becomes part of your inner life, you begin to see conflict differently. You see it as information about friction points rather than as a referendum on love, respect, or loyalty. You become less interested in winning and more interested in clarity. Clarity does not mean agreement. It means seeing what is true without needing to punish someone for it. It means being able to say, "This is what happened. This is what I experienced. This is what I need," without making the other person the enemy. Enemy making is the final step of reaction. Once the other person becomes the enemy, communication narrows to tactics. Everything becomes evidence. Everything becomes ammunition. Even kindness becomes suspicious. The relationship becomes a battlefield. A neutral mind is harder to recruit into enemy making because it does not need the enemy to justify its feelings. It can feel hurt without proving the other person is malicious. It can feel disappointed without constructing a villain. This is one of the most mature forms of emotional discipline, refusing to turn pain into character assassination. This refusal is not weakness. It is a decision to protect what is valuable. Many people damage relationships not because they do not care, but because they cannot tolerate the internal discomfort of conflict without exporting it. Neutrality makes that tolerance possible. It keeps you present. It keeps you from escalating. It keeps you from speaking in ways that create wounds that later require apology. It allows you to communicate like someone who intends to stay, not like someone who is trying to win a moment. Over time, the people around you begin to experience you differently, not because you have become passive, but because you have become safer. Safety here is not emotional comfort. It is the sense that you will not weaponize the moment, that you will not turn disagreement into humiliation, that you will not explode and then later claim you did not mean it. People can disagree with you without bracing for impact. That changes how they speak. They become more honest. They become less defensive. Communication deepens not because you demanded it, but because you removed the need for protection. Responses, then, are not simply better manners. They are a different way of inhabiting tension. They are the expression of a mind that can stay intact while unsettled, that can choose language without being possessed by sensation, that can let conflict be what it is rather than what it threatens to symbolize. The surprising thing is that this does not make life flatter. It makes it clearer. It allows love, respect, and truth to move through conversations that otherwise would be clogged by reaction. It turns conflict from a place where people try to win into a place where they can understand. And in that understanding, even when outcomes are imperfect, the relationship gains something rare, the feeling of being handled with care while still being handled with honesty.